Good morning, everybody. This feels strange being here in the pulpit in an empty sanctuary like this. I feel kind of like I'm seeing backstage how all the magic gets done here. Natalie, Jonathan, Lily, Paul, Kai this morning. Thank you so much for all that you all have done this past year and a half. It has been a sustaining grace for a lot of people, and I want you to know how much I appreciate the work that you've done and your ministry of presence, even in a time of social distancing. So years ago, I used to go out to Big Bend in West Texas, and we'd always check out Boquillas Canyon on the eastern side of the park. The canyon has walls 1,500 feet high, cut by the Rio Grande River. It's an amazing place. There was no border checkpoint out there back then, but if you wanted, you could just swim across. Or there were guys in small rafts who would take you across in the boat, and you could go into the village of Boquillas del Carmen, visit the cantina there, buy some gifts. Just a nice little oasis out in the desert. 20 years ago, right after September 11th, they closed the border between the U.S. and Mexico, and the people who lived in Boquillas del Carmen were cut off from the tourists they depended on for income, and also from the small general store in the national park where they bought their groceries. They had to drive 150 miles to the south down a caliche road to Musquis for provisions. The town of 300 people dwindled to less than 150 before they finally put in a checkpoint back in 2013. I wondered what happened during that time of isolation for them. What was it like to live out in the desert, along the river in such a remote spot, just a few hundred yards from a grocery store you couldn't visit, separated by family, from family, schools, jobs, friends on the other side? How did they manage? I decided to go find out. So a few months after the checkpoint opened, I drove out there to talk with people and just ask them what happened. I found on YouTube an artist named Bonnie Wonderlick who lived in Studi Butte. She seemed very involved in things out there, so I reached out to see if we could talk. We got breakfast the first morning I was there, and she said I should talk to Max Sanchez. He lives in Boquillas and organizes the people who sell the small handmade gifts you can find along the river near the canyon, and leads overnight horseback trips up into the mountains above the village on the Mexican side. He knows everybody out there, she said. He could tell me his story. She suggested other people to talk to as well, like Lilia Falcon, who owns the cantina in Boquillas, Mike Davidson, the city councilman in Alpine, who owns Far Flung Adventures, the river rafting service you can take down the river and do camping trips on the Rio Grande. He manages the raft service that takes you across the river from the checkpoint. And Enrique Madrid, a tribal chief in Redford whose tribe spans the river and has struggled under the post-9/11 conditions. I drove across the park from Studi Butte to the checkpoint at Boquillas and stood on the banks of the river looking across at the village. There were some men on the other side, and one of them called over to me. We couldn't quite hear each other very well because of the wind, so he and a dozen others just came across the river on horses and in a couple of canoes. One of them was Max Sanchez, and we had a chance to talk a little while. I gave him my cell number, and we agreed to meet the next day, and he'd show me around. When I came back, he drove me in his pickup up from the river to the town. I asked him about life during the time the border was closed for them. He said it was very hard. People would have to drive to Musquis for supplies. He said most people left. He and his wife divorced, and she and their kids moved to Acuna. He finally moved there as well and had just recently come back to Boquillas. We got something to eat at the cantina, and then we rode up to some sand dunes to the south of town where we could look straight up the canyon. Max said he had heard the American president wanted to build a wall along the border. He asked if I thought that would happen. I said, I didn't think so. As I talked with people, I found my questions were changing. I started out wondering what it was like living in Boquillas during those years when the border was shut down from them, and I heard their stories about that. But I began to notice that everyone I talked with seemed to have a different idea about what the border even is. It had never occurred to me to even wonder about that. I grew up on the border in McAllen, and it was just there, a thing. But on this trip, in these conversations, it seemed to become many things. For Max, it was the river, the canyon, the rocks he and his crews climbed along and hiked, selling their crafts. For Bonnie Wunderlich, it was part of the landscape she painted. For Feather Radha, another artist out there, it was the thing she swam in and across as a child, growing up in San Carlos. She said she was at the river when she heard about the 9/11 attacks. A kid on a horse rode by and told her America is at war, and she knew the border would be sealed pretty fast. She said back during Prohibition, it was alcohol coming across the border. In her childhood, it was beeswax coming north and appliances going south. Now, she said, it's drugs going north, clothes, guns, and money going south. For Mike Davidson, the city councilman, the border was a resource. It's something that needs to work, he said. Half of my customers are on the other side of that bridge. None of us can make it without our friends on each side. To think of it as a wall made no sense to him. It was a misunderstanding of what a border is. By the time I spoke with Enrique Madrid, the tribal chief, this question was swirling in my head. I came to his home, a converted gas station in Redford, and I talked with him and his wife Ruby for hours that afternoon. Their home is an archive of scholarly books, abstracts, government documents, videos, and newspapers. I asked him what he thought a border was. And he said that our modern notion of borders is a recent thing. They've always been seen as markers for territory, for taxing purposes, and that sort of thing. It's only been in the last 150 years or so that they've been used to control the movements of people to this degree. Before 9/11, the Texas border was a fairly porous thing, a clear division between the US and Mexico, but seasonal crops and grazing patterns meant people had to move back and forth. He noted that in Europe, you can drive from Spain to Denmark and never have to show a passport. National boundaries still exist there, he said, but the meaning has changed. I asked him if there's a good way to think about borders. Because of his tribe's experience, he said he thinks of every kind of border as a form of violence. There isn't a good way to do it, he said. He said that Europeans brought the idea of borders with them. He pointed out that our first president, George Washington, was a surveyor. It's what you do, he said. I spoke later with an archaeologist at Sul Ross State who'd done extensive research in the national park. I asked him about all this. I told him I had come to this project because the thought of using a river in the middle of a desert, the one thing you know people are going to gather at, as a way to divide people, seemed destined to create hardships. He said it had occurred to him that maybe we should use watersheds, mountain ranges and ridge lines, instead of rivers as boundaries. And that seems to make some sense. Why draw lines right through the middle of everybody's business, right? But as I've sat with this question, I think that might create more serious problems. Because the more we're able to think about other people on the other side of the boundary, the mountain or whatever, as those people over there, the easier it is to never have to live together, to work things out. What if we thought about a border not as a wall, but as a table, a gathering spot? A venue where people, distinct and different, but also connected by common needs and interests, are thrown together, where they have to work things out. Our lectionary reading from the epistles today in James says that the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without a trace of partiality or hypocrisy. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace for those who make peace. Those conflicts and disputes among you, where do they come from? Do they not come from your own cravings that are at war within you? I wonder if some of the conflicts we throw ourselves into, antagonisms over borders or vying to see who's the greatest, are mostly a way to distract us from these conflicts within. I don't know, but finding some clarity about that could help inform some of the ways we engage in conflict with each other. At least we know for sure what we're arguing about. Not long after 9/11, I had what to this day probably remains the best conversation I've ever had. We were living out in the country near Hamilton Pool at the time. One morning I was driving the girls to daycare on my way to work. They were in the back seat just talking and singing. When Emma asked me just out of the blue, she said, "Daddy, what is a year?" She used to do that a lot. I had to think about that a minute. I knew she wasn't going to drop it till she was satisfied with my answer, so I said, well, a year is how long it takes for us to make one trip around the sun. She seemed okay with that, and she said, how many times have you been around the sun? And I said, I've been around the sun 36 times. So she said, I've been around the sun 4 times. And I said, that's right. And she just sat back there for a while thinking about all this. And then she said, Daddy, I like going around the sun with you. I think about Emma's question a lot. What is a year? I think about what we're all doing here. We spend a lot of our time focusing on borders, things to divide us, distinguish us, make one person greater than another. But what if we're all just going around the sun together? What if we spent more time just trying to get better at that? There is a passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, which for me has always expressed the heart of the gospel. It's where Paul explains that God was in Christ, reconciling the world to himself, and has given us the ministry of reconciliation. And there it is. That's the gospel. God knows there's plenty in this world to be scared of, and we need guardrails, borders, systems to keep us all safe. But those things themselves can become dangerous if they blind us to the people on the other side. If we just draw lines on a map and project all of our fears on one side of that line, we're probably creating the thing we're afraid of. But if we can see that we're really all border people, navigating our way along the creases and seams in our lives, then perhaps we can think imaginatively about the metaphors we use that inform the ways we engage and respond to each other. Every event has 2 handles, the Greek philosopher Epictetus said, one by which it can be carried and one by which it can't. If your brother does you wrong, Don't grab it by his wronging, because this is the handle incapable of lifting it. Instead, use the other, that he is your brother, that you were raised together, and then you will have hold of the handle that carries. This is the ministry of reconciliation that Paul was talking about. We need each other. Their river is our river. Their future is our future. Their children's future is our children's future. Let's think about this trip around the sun we're on right now and see if we can find ways to make it together. Amen.